Right then, here we are once again in War Thunder, where today we're taking a little look at everyone's favourite British biplane, the Hawker Fury, specifically the Hawker's Fury Mark I and Mark II. Now, as per usual, this particular video will be going over the history of the Hawker Fury. If you're more interested in the technical details or seeing it in battle, I'm afraid you'll have to wait for parts 2 and 3. But for those of us intelligent folk who care about history, let us strap on our leather flying helmets, put on our frankly rather dashing pilot's uniforms, and hold up our hands to our faces in a manner that might suggest we are wearing flying goggles, as we scramble into the history of the Hawker Fury. Now, to begin with, as we must for most of these early biplanes, we must go back to before the First World War and the dawn of British aviation. During the 19th century, flight, like many other fields of science at the time, was pursued with some considerable interest in Britain, to the extent that a dedicated scientific organisation, the Aeronautical Society of Great Britain, later called the Royal Aeronautical Society, was created in 1866. This society facilitated several key breakthroughs in the field of early aviation, from the development of gliders to the scientific study of cambered wings being the key for generating lift. Victorian Britain for a time was the world leader in pursuing powered heavier-than-air flight, going as far as to enable Matthew Piers Watt Boulton to patent the world's first aileron system in 1868. So close was Britain to achieving powered flight, it seemed, that France greatly expanded its own aeronautical research efforts, which eventually led to French aeronautical development surpassing that of Britain. The main obstacle to achieving powered flight remained, however, that of creating an engine that was both light enough to be able to be mounted on an aerial vehicle, but also powerful enough to allow said vehicle to achieve speeds sufficient for it to become airborne. Although the steam engine was the obvious candidate, it was the most powerful source of kinetic energy available at the time and formed the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. By nature, it was far too heavy to be utilised as an aeronautical power plant. Despite John Stringfellow winning a £100 prize at the 1868 Crystal Palace exhibition for developing an incredibly light yet reasonably powerful steam engine, one which was utilised previously for a series of unmanned powered flights in Somerset, the fact that all steam engines required water, coal and a pressurised reinforced boiler made them simply too heavy to produce the power needed to make themselves airborne. For this reason, it was not until the development of the internal combustion engine, fueled by petroleum, that a suitable power plant for aviation was found. One reason for Britain's reduced rate of progress in the field of aviation during the later years of the 19th century was the lack of interest from the British Army and Royal Navy. Aside from observation balloons for reconnaissance and artillery spotting, the British Army saw no need in pursuing what was clearly a fad, which was powered flight. Obviously, these winged mechanical contraptions would never be useful on the modern battlefield. It was for this reason that it was 1907, 4 years after the Wright Flyer's first flight, by the time that Samuel Franklin Cody was able to persuade the British Army to let him create an aeroplane at the balloon factory in Farnborough. The resulting contraption, the British Army Aeroplane No. 1, first flew officially on the 16th of October 1908, piloted by Samuel Cody himself. The British Army Aeroplane No. 1 made several flights in 1908 and 1909, undergoing several design modifications and revisions as its flight characteristics were studied and damage occurred due to crashes. Until February 1909, government funding was cancelled in favour of developing dirigibles. Despite this, Cody was allowed to keep the Aeroplane No. 1 and continued to develop and improve it until it made its crowning flight of over 40 miles, or 64 kilometres, in September 1909. Samuel Franklin Cody went on to create more aircraft, such as the Cody Michelin Cup biplane, having been officially made a British citizen, for indeed, when he developed the British Army Aircraft No. 1, Samuel Cody was an American. British military aviation focused entirely on lighter-than-air vehicles until 1911. The Army Balloon Factory was explicitly forbidden from designing or constructing aeroplanes. However, one aspiring aeronautical engineer, one Geoffrey de Havilland, found a loophole in this rule, in that the Army Balloon Factory was technically allowed to repair aeroplanes. Therefore, when a French Blériot 12 crashed in Lake Hill, Wiltshire, de Havilland was granted permission to try and repair it. What he did was to completely dismantle the Blériot monoplane and build an entirely new aircraft to his own design using the components. The resulting aircraft, named the Royal Aircraft Factory SE-1, first flew on the 11th of June 1911, piloted by de Havilland himself. The SE-1 proved invaluable in further progressing British aviation technology, and several modifications were made to improve its flying characteristics, until tragically it crashed on the 18th of August 1911, killing its pilot Theodore J. Ridge. Despite this, de Havilland was able to pull a similar trick to get around the War Office's restrictions on constructing aeroplanes when he completely redesigned a damaged Voisin, donated to the War Office by the Duke of Westminster. This aircraft, named the Royal Aircraft Factory BE-1, shared almost nothing in common with the preceding Voisin, save for its Wolseley engine. It first flew on the 4th of December 1911, again piloted by de Havilland. For 3 months, de Havilland flew and modified the BE-1 until the 11th of March 1912. The aircraft was handed over to the newly formed Air Battalion of the Royal Engineers, thereby making it the first official aeroplane used by the British Army. Although the BE-1 was never itself used in combat, its successor, the Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2, again designed by de Havilland using a crashed Breguet as a basis, was accepted into production for the Royal Engineers Air Battalion as a general-purpose aeroplane, and would later be used by the Royal Flying Corps during the early months of the First World War. However, the BE-2 suffered heavy losses at the hands of Germany's Fokker fighters, and so was withdrawn from service in 1915. And this is where we shall leave Geoffrey de Havilland and the Royal Aircraft Factory for now, and instead turn our attention to perhaps the most famous aviation company of the First World War, the Sopwith Aviation Company. Sopwith Aviation was established in 1912 by a rich playboy-type party dude named Thomas Octave Murdoch Sopwith, who liked fast cars, big yachts, and cruising various Rivieras and such. Naturally, his early aircraft were designed to be just the thing for young jet-setting entrepreneurs such as himself, small luxury float planes that would cause a stir at the party, such as the Sopwith Bat Boat. His first major success came in the form of the Sopwith Schneider, a racing float plane which won the 1914 Schneider Trophy, flown by Howard Pixton. The Royal Naval Air Service and Royal Flying Corps were both very interested in this vehicle, and both placed orders of the Sopwith Schneider, which was now known as the Sopwith Tabloid because of the sensation it caused with the press, for use as a military aircraft. The Tabloid was used to some success during the First World War as a scout aircraft and light bomber, with its most famous operation being the attack against the German Zeppelin sheds in Dusseldorf in October 1914, where Sopwith tabloids managed to destroy the Zeppelin Z9 with 2 20-pound bombs. Now, you might be wondering why we're talking about Sopwith Aviation in a video that's supposed to be about the Hawker Fury. To those, I say you might be interested to know that the chief test pilot at the Sopwith Aviation Company was none other than one Harry George Hawker. Harry Hawker was born on the 22nd of January 1889 in a small town in Victoria, Australia called Moolrabin. The son of a blacksmith, he started working at a garage from the age of 11. In 1910, at the age of 21, Hawker went to Diggers Rest in Melbourne to witness the first public demonstration of powered flight in Australia. Harry immediately knew that he wanted to be part of the burgeoning aviation industry, and by May the next year he had made the long and arduous voyage to England to become involved. Although he initially found work in the car industry, working for Commer, Mercedes and Austro-Daimler, Harry Hawker spent much of his time in Brooklands, which at the time was the aviation capital of the British Empire, hoping for an in into one of the aircraft companies operating there. There he met with Tom Sopwith, who offered him a job as a mechanic. After getting Tom to teach him to fly, Harry quickly demonstrated his talent at piloting, and was made chief test pilot at the Sopwith Aviation Company, just 4 years later. Among Hawker's early aviation feats were altitude records, the Michelin Cup Endurance Award, and the establishment of one of the first techniques for recovering an aircraft from an uncontrolled spin, a situation that had killed many pilots before then.
At 2 turns, recovery will be affected by centralizing the controls, and again I'm going to use my duct tape references to know where aileron, elevator, and rudder neutral will be. Power's coming back to idle. Ailerons are neutral for now. Decelerating for spin entry. Left rudder in, stick back and holding. Half turn. 1. Half 2. Controls are now centralized. And recovery is affected. And return to level flight.
Throughout the First World War, Harry Hawker continued to be chief test pilot for some of the most famous British aircraft developed during that conflict, such as the 1.5 Strutter, the Sopwith Pup, the Sopwith Triplane, and of course the legendary Sopwith Camel. After the war, Hawker continued to work for Sopwith, as well as continuing to pursue feats in aviation, including in 1919 an attempt to win the £10,000 prize, which in 1919 years was certainly nothing to sneeze at, from the Daily Mail, which should absolutely be sneezed at, for the first transatlantic flight in less than 72 hours. However, 14 hours after taking off from Newfoundland, the experimental Sopwith Atlantic he was flying began to overheat, and despite making several attempts to remedy the situation, Hawker and his navigator Kenneth Grieve were forced to ditch in the North Atlantic next to a Danish ship called the SS Mary, which thankfully rescued them. Unfortunately, because the Mary did not have a radio, for almost a week it was believed that Hawker and Grieve had been killed on this perilous flight, until the SS Mary finally arrived in Scotland on the 25th of May. Although the Daily Mail prize was of course won by John Alcock and Arthur Brown, flying their modified Vickers Vimy bomber, Hawker was nevertheless awarded a £5,000 prize for being the first pilot to fly more than 1,000 miles over an ocean. In September 1920, the Sopwith Aviation Company was closed down in order to avoid a retrospective tax being claimed on Sopwith's wartime production. Tom Sopwith took Harry Hawker, as well as Fred Sigrist and Bill Eyre, to establish a new aviation company, which Tom Sopwith named H.G. Hawker Engineering, stating that he, Hawker, was largely responsible for our growth during the war. Sadly, Harry Hawker never got to see his new company flourish, for less than a year later, on the 12th of July 1921, he took off from Hendon Aerodrome in his Newport Goshawk, but a few moments later crashed into the ground. The post-mortem examination found that Hawker had suffered a hemorrhage, making it impossible for him to land the plane. Harry Hawker was buried in Hook, Surrey, leaving behind a wife and 2 daughters. The first aircraft created by H.G. Hawker Engineering was the unsuccessful Hawker Duiker, which was rejected by the newly created Royal Air Force as a reconnaissance aircraft due to stability issues that arose during its first flight in 1923. Hawker's first successful design was the Hawker Woodcock, designed as a night fighter, However, although it first flew in 1923, the prototype suffered from wing flutter and structural issues, meaning that it was not accepted into service until 1925 when these problems had been ironed out. 64 Hawker Woodcocks were built in total, plus an additional 15 modified examples that were sold to the Danish Air Force, known as the Hawker Danecock. 12 more were license-built by the Danish Royal Naval Dockyards as the Orlogsværftet LB-2 Dancock. Right, that's enough about woodcocks and Danecocks and cocks in general, so you can all get your minds out of the gutter. Because now it's time for a quick rundown of Hawker aircraft from 1923 to 1928. In 1924, Hawker built 2 very small civil biplanes, called the Hawker Signet. Next came the Hawker Hedgehog later that year, designed as a naval reconnaissance aircraft. However, the project was cancelled due to the prototype displaying rather lackluster performance. In 1925, Hawker developed a new single-engined bomber that could also carry a torpedo, known as the Hawker Horsley, named after Tom Sopwith's house, Horsley Towers. The Horsley was accepted into service with the RAF, and 124 were built, including 6 which were sent to Greece to be used by the Hellenic Naval Air Service, and 2 modified with floats to be sent to Denmark, renamed as the Hawker Dantorp HB-3. One interesting fact about the Hawker Horsley is that although one modified example ran out of fuel during an attempted non-stop flight from Britain to India, the Horsley set a new world distance record for an aircraft, flown by Roderick Carr and L.E.M. Gilman. However, this record was broken a few hours later by Charles Lindbergh in his Spirit of St. Louis. Next came the Hawker Heron fighter aircraft, of which one example was built. However, the Air Ministry was not interested in a new fighter at the time. After the Heron came the Hawker Hornbill, another fighter. Again, only one prototype was built, which suffered from a cramped cockpit and problems with overheating. Hawker's next design was the Hawker Harrier, intended to replace the Hawker Horsley as the RAF's coastal torpedo bomber. Yet again, only one prototype was built, the Air Ministry contract going to the Vickers Wildebeest, after the Hawker aircraft was found to be underpowered. Following the Harrier, in 1927 came the Hawker Hawfinch, which was another bid for that lucrative RAF fighter contract. Again, only one prototype was built, due to the Bristol Bulldog being found to be superior. And finally, we come to the Hawker Aviation Company's first major success, the Hawker Hart. Answering a 1928 government request for a new light bomber to replace the Hawker Horsley and Fairy Fox, the Hawker Hart prototype beat the competition, the Avro Antelope, which was more expensive, and the de Havilland Hound, which suffered from stability problems during landing, and entered service in 1930. In service, the Hawker Hart proved to be one of the most capable bomber aircraft of its time, with a top speed of 184 miles per hour or 296 kilometers per hour, which was faster than many contemporary fighters, including the RAF's primary frontline fighter, the Bristol Bulldog. The Hart's manoeuvrability also made it quite capable of defending itself from attacking fighters. Naturally, this very capable, quite inexpensive light bomber proved very popular, not only with the RAF, but with several air forces around the world, including Sweden, who obtained a license to produce them domestically, and ended up manufacturing 42 by ASJA, Götaverken, and CVM, under the name B4. The Royal Egyptian Air Force, the Royal Indian Air Force, the South African Air Force, the Estonian Air Force, the Air Force of Southern Rhodesia, and the Royal Yugoslavian Air Force. In total, some 962 Hawker Harts were built in Britain by Hawker themselves, Armstrong Whitworth, Gloucester, and Vickers. Several variants were also built, including the Hart India, which featured larger radiators, the Hart Trainer with dual controls, the Swedish Hart, which replaced the Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine with a radial Bristol Pegasus, The Hawker Audax Army Cooperation aircraft, of which more than 700 examples were built, the Hawker Hartbeest light bomber, designed for operation by the South African Air Force, the Hawker Demon, which was essentially a fighter variant of the basic Hart, the Hawker Hardy, which was a tropicalized variant designed to replace the Westland Wapiti, the Hawker Hind, which featured a more powerful version of the Rolls-Royce Kestrel, and the Hawker Hector, which was similar to the Hind but designed to replace the Audax. Of these last two, Afghanistan bought 8, Latvia bought 3 with Bristol Mercury radial engines, Persia bought 35 to a similar specification, Portugal bought 4, Switzerland obtained 1, Yugoslavia bought another 3, and many more went to several other countries. Lastly came the Hawker Osprey, which was essentially a Hart modified for operating on board aircraft carriers. The Hawk and its derivatives were used by Britain mostly for policing duties and suppressing unruliness within the British Empire. However, by the outbreak of the Second World War, most British Harts had been relegated to training duties. 4 Swedish Harts also saw service in Finland during the Winter War, where Swedish volunteers utilised them very effectively as dive bombers, despite the fact that the Hart had never been intended for this role. 1 month after the first flight of the prototype Hawker Hart in June 1928, HG Hawker Engineering rolled another prototype aircraft out onto RAF Martlesham Heath Airfield for its inaugural flight. This prototype, designated the Hawker F-20/27, was a response to the Air Ministry's call for a new interceptor fighter, and was a simple biplane of conventional fabric covering a metal frame, with a heavily staggered sesquiplane wing configuration. It was powered by a single Bristol Mercury 6 9-cylinder radial engine developing 520 horsepower. The F-20/27 entered the Air Ministry's competition alongside several competitors, including the Armstrong Whitworth Starling II, the Bristol Bullpup, the de Havilland DH-77, Fairey Firefly II, Saunders A-10, Vickers Jockey, and the Westland Interceptor. Despite performing well in these trials, the F-20/27, and indeed all of the participants, were not granted a government contract, and the project was cancelled. Hawker, however, retained the F-20/27 prototype, and after realising the success of the Hawker Hart, with its speed making it outstanding not only as a bomber, but even as a fighter, the Hawker Company decided to see what would happen if they installed the 420 horsepower V12 inline Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine from the Hart into the F-20/27 instead of the more powerful but less aerodynamic Bristol radial engine. The resulting aircraft, named the Hawker Hornet, first flew in March 1929 and was praised for its speed and manoeuvrability, becoming the first RAF fighter aircraft to fly faster than 200 miles per hour in level flight. After being evaluated against the Fairey Firefly II, which was heavier and slower due to its wooden construction, the Hornet was ordered into production in 1930, with 21 aircraft being ordered. Following some minor improvements and being renamed Hawker Fury following Air Ministry concerns that Hornet didn't sound ferocious enough, the Fury entered into production following its March 1931 initial test flight, officially entering service in May of that year. Despite its superior performance to most RAF aircraft at the time, especially its predecessor, the Bristol Bulldog, only a small number of Hawker Fury Mark I fighters were ordered due to budget cuts to the Air Ministry being imposed as a result of the Great Depression, ultimately equipping only 2 squadrons. The Hawker Fury Mark II, entering service in 1936, equipped a further 4 squadrons, bringing the total number of RAF fighter squadrons to fly the Hawker Fury up to 6, which, considering that no fewer than 10 squadrons were equipped with the inferior Bristol Bulldog, demonstrates that although it was perhaps one of the best fighter aircraft of the early 1930s, the Hawker Fury was not given much of a chance to prove itself, at least not in RAF service. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, the Hawker Fury had been withdrawn from frontline service, being replaced with the Gloucester Gladiator, Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire, and would be utilised throughout the war as a training aircraft. Although the Hawker Fury never saw combat with the Royal Air Force, it was exported to several other countries, many of which did use it operationally. 3 Hawker Furies were ordered by Spain in 1935, with the intention of license producing a variant powered by a more powerful Hispano-Suiza 12XBR engine. And although these 3 initial aircraft were delivered in July 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out less than a week later. The 3 Furies were taken by the Spanish Republican Air Force, fitted with machine guns salvaged from a crashed nationalist aircraft, and used against the fascists during the siege of Madrid. However, it seems they were all lost due to crashing for one reason or another. In 1936, 10 Hawker Fury Mark IIs were ordered by the Royal Yugoslav Air Force, modified with the newer, more powerful Rolls-Royce Kestrel 16 engine, cantilever undercarriage, and an additional pair of machine guns under the lower wings. The Yugoslavian companies Icarus and Zmaj obtained licenses to build a further 40 Yugoslav Furies. These were still in service with the Royal Yugoslav Air Force by the time of Germany's invasion in April 1941. Despite fighting heroically against the invading Nazis, with one Yugoslavian Fury managing to destroy a Messerschmitt Bf-109 by literally ramming it in mid-air, these old obsolete fighters were completely outnumbered and outclassed by the far more advanced Luftwaffe forces, meaning that by the 15th of April, when Yugoslavia signed its armistice, most had been either shot down or destroyed on the ground, with the remainder being destroyed by the Yugoslavians upon their surrender. The South African Air Force also used the Hawker Fury in North Africa, having been given 30 by the RAF, which was replacing them with Hurricanes at the time. The South Africans used them to some success against the Italian Air Force, using them to strafe airfields primarily, although on one occasion South African Furies successfully shot down 2 Italian Caproni CA-310 light bombers. Persia also bought 16 Hawker Furies, modified with Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines, in 1933, with an additional 6 with Bristol Mercury engines ordered in 1934. These were used against the RAF during the Anglo-Soviet invasion in August 1941, however they were easily swept aside by the much more modern Hurricanes used by the British. A single Hawker Fury Mark I, fitted with an Armstrong Siddeley Panther radial engine, was built for the Norwegian Army Air Service as a trial aircraft. However, Norway did not adopt the model for service. The last operator was the Portuguese Aeronautica Militar, who purchased 3 Hawker Fury Mark Is, however these were soon retired in favour of the more modern Gloucester Gladiator in 1940. In total, around 262 Hawker Furies were built, mostly in Britain. Despite being completely obsolete at the outbreak of the Second World War, at the time of its introduction in 1931, the Hawker Fury was one of the most capable fighter aircraft in the world. However, it was never able to properly prove itself in combat, always being either much older, far fewer in number, or both when compared to their opposition, and so suffered accordingly. For this reason, and perhaps because it was never used in combat by the RAF itself, the Hawker Fury is typically forgotten by most, with its bigger brother, the Hawker Hart, usually being the first British interwar aircraft to come to mind, if at all. Nevertheless, this sleek little biplane does hold one very important place in the history of aviation. In 1933, the chief designer of H.G. Hawker Engineering, which had just been renamed Hawker Aircraft Limited that year, proposed a new aircraft design to meet a government requirement for a new fighter aircraft. His idea was to take a Hawker Fury and remove the upper wing and make it a monoplane. This was the start of a journey which would one day result in one of the finest aircraft in British aviation history, the workhorse of the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, the Hawker Hurricane. That story, however, will have to wait for another video, for it is time now to say goodbye. But fear not, dear viewer, for we shall return to the Hawk of Fury in the next video, where we shall be examining its technical details. In the meantime, however, all that remains to be said is thank you very much for watching. And if you liked the video, hey, why not like and subscribe? Bring a big old smile to an old man's face. Also, why not consider joining my Discord, where you can speak to me directly, talk to other like-minded individuals, get together for War Thunder sessions, all that stuff. Isn't that fun? Anywho, that's all from me. Thank you again for watching, and hopefully see you next time. Goodbye!